Greetings, loyal listeners. You are now listening to an encore presentation of a B30 sharing session. So please stand by as the previously recorded podcast will begin shortly. Thank you once again for choosing B30 for your listening pleasure. Really looking forward to this session because the topic brings about an intersection of my undergraduate social science background and kind of my own personal belief system. Before we dive into how this term called hypermasculinity impacts church or Christian ministry and spiritual growth, I just want to take a minute and reminisce on my first year Sociology 100 learning content. And I was really thinking about a week in the fall where we spent about a good 2-3 classes talking about social conditioning and gendered behavior. So one term that really stuck out for me was gender scripts. I'm not sure about sociology, maybe psychology too. But the point is, you have these predetermined and assigned thoughts and actions that are considered acceptable or appropriate for your biological sex. So we call those gender scripts or gender norms, all those fancy social science terms. But for example, for the male gender or male gender role or male gender identity, it celebrates and promotes this thing called masculinity, which is basically like a fancy word for gotta be manly, gotta be rugged, macho. And little do you know, this form of social conditioning of your male gender role or identity it's shaped from infancy. So the minute your mother puts you in a blue onesie, the color blue, to the toys you play with, like Legos and trucks when you're in your toddler ages, and even to your early childhood, pre-adolescence when you're picking sports to play, like football and hockey, very rugged stuff instead of, I don't know, is there feminine sports? Back in high school, field hockey was considered kind of a female sports. There was like a girls grade 8 to 12 field hockey team, but there wasn't one for boys. So perhaps in that narrow definition, that can be considered a quote-unquote feminine sport. And funny story, I actually played field hockey in PE class in high school, and my teacher said I was actually good at it. And he kind of pat me on the back and encouraged me. But funny thing is, coach or teacher, there is no males field hockey team. So do you want me to join the ladies team or something? Anyways, I just thought that was interesting how I was good at a quote-unquote feminine sport in high school. Anyways, social conditioning, gender identity, and gender behavioral scripts. So another thing it pervades into is academics. It's kind of like that stupid stereotype like, oh, ladies in engineering or guys in women's studies, and even your career choices like men getting office assistant jobs or administrative assistant jobs as opposed to being the CEO. So all these little subtle decisions that people make growing up, they actually are somewhat influenced by your gender script that you're growing up, and even seeps into your social life. If you go out to buy a drink, alcoholic drink, dudes get whiskey or beer or some kind of hard alcohol. And it's kind of a taboo or norm that you don't try to get a colored drink like a prickly pear or an apple martini and there's like an umbrella sticking in it. Even what we like to drink is indirectly influenced by our gender identity and predetermined, prescribed gender norms. Let me just say that if you want to raise your children in these kind of safe, well-defined gender norms, that's fine. But what I like to propose is when you hold fast so rigidly to these male gender identity scripts, men need to do rugged and macho activities. You can take this too far and land yourself in what sociological and psychological discourse likes to term hypermasculinity, where you're adhering too much into these socially constructed ways of what manly behavior is that it kind of affects all aspects of your life for the worse. And surely enough, came across a great piece written by James Dwyer that took it one step further and also wanted to mention how these masculine ideals can not only influence all realms of a person's life, but it can also seep into and infiltrate your spiritual life as well. Now, what James Dwyer talks about in his article
may seem like he's generalizing that all church communities are exhibiting these trends that men are sexist, like, really rigid defined categories. Men do this, girls do this. He's not saying that all church communities are exhibiting these well-defined gendered behavior, but he just wants to point out there may be a considerable number of church folk out there who still inadvertently operate under these norms and practices. It's just something for our own benefit to be just mindful that we're not excluding or alienating certain newcomers or certain members of our church or unchurched community. So one thing that James Dwyer talked about is how masculinity and its unrealistic ideals can influence church ministry. And one example is something as simple as small group activities. Something you think that's really innocent and fun, like a barbecue or play sports and let's do some gaming together, something fun and relaxing. But if you think about it, barbecues, and you have, depending on age range and what the vibe is, you might have beers and hard alcohol. And sports, it might get intense depending on what you play, level of aggression. And gaming, in terms of what game, video games or computer games, what you choose, maybe a high level of violence. When you go into that territory, you don't realize you may be excluding people who are the exception. For example, if it's small group activities for guys and you're doing barbecues and sports and games, what about those dudes who like romance novels? And what if there are vegans who have vegan dessert recipes, but you've created this super hyper masculine environment they might not feel comfortable opening up? Or guys that like foreign films and are more artistic. Who knows? There are dudes who are into fashion and, watch Project Runway or America's Next Top Model. I don't know. But if these exceptions to the rule show up at a small group activity, for me, I'm a jerk. My first gut reaction is if I found out these dudes like these atypical manly things, quote unquote, I'm going to tease them mercilessly and give them a hard time. But I guess that's part of the hyper-masculine male bonding approach is we insult each other. And that's a way how a typical hyper-masculine group of men kind of bond. But at the end of the day, you create this hostile environment and people don't want to come who don't fit the mold we've created. And another thing is when it's just about games and barbecue and being manly and just eating and drinking and being loud and making trouble, the foundation of the relationship is fundamentally shallow. You reduce Christian fellowship to just a good time. And it ultimately leads to the question, how are we different from non-religious support groups or clubs? There needs to be some intangible godly character in our fellowship where there's a personal aspect of care and concern. Now, I can speak to this because years back, I've led a small group activity. And this was a time when I was really into drinking and I was really into the MTV Jackass franchise and all the shenanigans that they do. So early 20s, I'm into drinking and blowing stuff up, hurting myself in terms of doing buffoonery activities. So in other words, I was immature jerk. And I got picked to lead a small group activity for a bunch of dudes. And looking back, it was kind of a gamer, into movies, watching TV kind of bunch. But I really didn't put any thought into leading a small group, so I just think we just had takeout pizza, and then we had an hour and a half to kill, and I was like, hey, I don't know, I brought some UFC DVDs. Let's watch a bunch of dudes in a cage wail on each other and try to break each other's arms and legs. I guess the guys didn't want to say, oh, I don't want to watch it, because the hyper-masculine ideology here is, oh, two guys fighting and bleeding and sweating. I'm a manly man. I'm going to enjoy watching this. So nobody spoke up saying they don't want to watch it. But in hindsight, I think being socially conditioned with these masculine ideals, it really clouded my judgment on picking what the small group of guys would have enjoyed. And looking back, maybe something simple like bringing a board game would have been more appropriate and suitable. But my hyper-masculine train of thought is board games. Well, that's kind of socially acceptable if it's a mixture of guys and girls. If it's just a bunch of dudes playing on a board game, that's kind of quote-unquote feminine and not really manly. I guess that was a prime example how masculine ideals wasted an opportunity to bond. I admit I did a poor job. But being the jerk that I am, I'm going to poke fun at or play the blame game and say, well, at least it was probably more fun than women's or girls' small groups where it's all lame and girly. But underneath all that teasing, perhaps women's small groups are more fruitful and healthy. Mr. Author James Dwyer proposed that women's small groups actually are a very successful model of how to promote healthy emotional and spiritual expression. Now, I know it's very stereotypical to say, the ladies' dessert nights or arts and crafts night or, book club are kind of like boring and snooze fest, and there's probably tea time and doilies and coasters. But if you think about it, topics they talk about: family, your job, your relationships, your health. There's this safe environment where the emotional and physical topics are intertwined and are open for sharing with friends. And ultimately, they're encouraged to know almost everything about each other and what's happening in their lives. So as a stereotypical male, I may tease all that I want about their activities, but they're the ones who are laughing to the bank, so to speak, with this fruitful and healthy relationship. Kind of begs the question, why can't guys achieve this level of interpersonal interaction and intimacy? And James Dwyer puts it very plainly: most men groups would be uncomfortable with the idea of having everyone sit in a circle and talk about their feelings. And this goes back to the term mentioned earlier, hypermasculinity, where we're so obsessed with being manly and looking like we have it all together that these unrealistic masculine ideals causes men to be overcautious of self-expression. It's kind of like the unwritten rules of the manly man's club is: number 1, can't be overly emotional. Number 2, try not to share too much about yourself. All secretive, strong, and silent. And then it just falls into this whole category of boys don't cry, they're the providers. There's nothing wrong with being strong and silent. If you love those noble characteristics of the masculine man, then by all means, go for it. But when you go too far, the problem is it promotes an unhealthy amount of self-reliance, which is counter to the Christian ideal of should be relying on God, not yourself. So here are some negative consequences of hypermasculinity. Number 1, you struggle to explain your emotions. And when you do that, men often feel cornered because they can't speak about it. They don't find someone comfortable to speak about it. So what do? You bottle up your issues. And that's pretty much the first ingredient to aggression and violence in society. That explains a lot. Bar brawls, when fights break out, when there's drinking involved in parking lots, or even sporting events, and when your sport team loses and there's alcohol involved. All this can be, I won't say this is all due to masculinity, but the hyper-masculine ideal does play a considerable or significant role in how men express themselves in terms of their violent behavior. Let's see some examples, like even road rage. You start to add one and one together and think, now I see why men express themselves like that, because they bottle up their issues and it's all part of their gender identity. And when you need to wear a mask of strength, but you're like breaking down inside because of these unrealistic expectations you're supposed to live up to be a true man, you experience what the social science world calls like role strain, or I think they call it dissonance or cognitive dissonance, where you're basically torn all the time to be manly, but got to keep everything to yourself. So the significance here is when there's an inability to communicate and express yourself properly, it eventually crosses over into your spiritual aspect of your life. If you have trouble talking about emotions, you're going to struggle to talk to God, say in a prayer context, to express love, concern, or passion for Him. Because, and I can relate, it does kind of feel feminine sometimes to say, "Oh, I love you, God." Like, honestly, just me saying that right now made me feel uncomfortable. And again, that's probably due to my emotional unavailability and a mixture of gendered norms that I've been conditioned to. But the fact is, sometimes it's cheesy and corny to say things like, "Oh, I love you, God, with all of my heart." Not that it sounds insincere, but I can see why certain hyper-masculine males in a prayer or spiritual context may have trouble expressing themselves to God. But at the end of the day, James Dwyer in his article warns that the church must ensure that in its attempt to reach out and attract men, it doesn't create a definition of a man that only fits certain molds. Therefore, when you're going out to outreach, get people to come to small groups, there needs to be this fine balance of activities that not only cater to the athletic, but also the artistic. Now, there is biblical precedence that supports that men possess a healthy balance of both masculine and sensitive and communicative and expressive traits as well. So James Dwyer draws on an example of King David, the psalmist David, the shepherd, the warrior, the king, the poet, and I think in 2 Samuel 6, he was also a dancer too. He liked to dance. So you have this great model to follow where you got this guy who's fought in wars, who's bled, who's cried, but at the same time, in the latter half of his life, he loved writing poetry to express his heart to God. So here's a prime example of a biblical character, male character, who took on many different characteristics. But the more important thing is, none of which made him more or less of a man. I mean, let's drop the tough guy act and let's emulate this biblical model. Let's break free from these unhealthy ideals of hyper-masculinity. And more importantly, let's break free from that fear of social awkwardness where you emotionally express yourself to others. Now, it's easier said than done. I guess it's a good time to end with a quote. It is easier to raise strong children than to fix broken men. I'm going to leave you with that. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.